The concept of free will is so frequently taken for granted that most would not even think to question it. However, I would suggest this is because few take the time to examine what they actually mean by it. I want to spend a few moments discussing different ways in which free will can be defined. Through an analysis of these possible definitions, I will argue that there is no way to coherently define a realistic concept of free will in humanity. Christians believe this tradition because they take the concept for granted, it being the common assumption among most everyone else around them, without seriously examining and challenging what they assume to be true. It is not my intention to present a biblical argument against free will here. That I will do elsewhere, as Scripture is my real basis for arguing that man's will is enslaved. Rather, here my primary intention is to examine the concept of free will and possible ways in which to define the term, in order to simply demonstrate that those who use such terminology are not being very coherent or consistent in doing so. So before anyone criticizes me for relying on philosophy instead of Scripture to argue my Calvinism, no, I am not presenting a positive case for Calvinism. I am questioning the consistency of those who argue against Calvinism. My positive case for my position will come in later posts. Now, in order to avoid the tremendous amount of confusion that so often colors the Calvinism debate, we have to define our terms. Free will is a philosophical term, not a biblical term, so it must be defined by those who wish to use such language. Further, free will cannot be defined in a way that makes it synonymous to the mere act of choosing, because the debate on free will involves questions concerning the nature of man's choices, not the reality of them. Yet the arguments of many free will proponents seem to ignore this, or perhaps they're just not aware of it. The typical strategy, for example, involves little more than referencing scripture verses that refer to the fact that men choose Christ, as if that is somehow supposed to settle something. This equivocation inevitably results in a failure to recognize what those who oppose free will are actually arguing, which in itself unfortunately accounts for a vast majority of the debates that take place. Dave Hunt, for instance, argues from page 169 and following in his book, What Love Is This?, that the Calvinist view implies that God causes people to do things as if they were, quote, cardboard puppets, end quote. In a radio broadcast in 2010 by Chuck Smith and Brian Broderson of Calvary Chapel, the statement was made that Calvinists believe God, quote, makes it impossible for men to come to him, end quote. In another radio broadcast, also of Calvary Chapel, one individual makes the claim that Calvinists believe, quote, man does not have a will, end quote. Also of Calvary Chapel, George Bryson has likened Calvinism to fatalism in his book, The Dark Side of Calvinism, page 21. Norman Geisler accuses the Calvinist position on page 47 of Chosen But Free of suggesting that God, quote, forces people into his kingdom against their wills, end quote. Every one of these accusations, and there are so many more like them, is so far off the mark it is just embarrassing. Not one of these men, or the many like them, has apparently ever taken the time to seriously study and seek to understand the view they oppose before hastily trying to find ways to dismiss it. This is dishonest scholarship, and yet it is representative of the kind of argumentation we hear coming from the vast majority of non-Calvinists. I'd like to offer a proposal. I suggest that there are essentially two ways in which free will can be broadly defined. One of these ways will prove to be unrealistic upon examination, and is therefore easily objectionable. The other way is no real definition of free will at all, because it simply involves equating the concept of free will with what it means to simply have a will. I suggest that this is no definition of free will at all, because no one would object to the fact that we have a will, and yet there are people who object to the idea that our will is free. Thus, any coherent definition of the concept must articulate a distinction between what it means to have a will and what it means for the will to be free. However, this, as I will show, will leave us only with the option of defining free will in such a way that the concept must simply be dismissed as nonsense. So my proposal is that we should do away with free will terminology altogether. Either it causes confusion by postulating an incoherent concept, or it describes a view of humanity that anyone should be able to agree is unrealistic. So what are these definitions? We can describe the actions of the will as either being uncaused or caused. I suggest that any definition of the nature of choice must fall into one of these categories. Let's examine the definitions carefully. The human will is uncaused in its operation. While it may be influenced by internal or external factors, these factors do not necessarily have to impact the decision that is made. The human will is caused in its operation. While the will still operates legitimately, that is to say, men do make their own choices, There are always internal and/or external factors in play that will inevitably not only impact the decision-making process, but necessarily determine the outcome. I don't see another way of defining the will. Either the will is A, unaffected by internal and external factors, in which case it is uncaused, B, potentially influenced by internal and external factors, but not necessarily determined by them, in which case we can also say the will is uncaused, or at least can be, or C, determined by internal and external factors, in which case the will is caused. Further, note that both of these definitions acknowledge the fact that man has a will. Neither view denies the fact that men make their own choices. The second definition, that the will is caused, does not imply that a man unconsciously goes about doing things like a puppet being pulled on strings. That is not the sense in which I'm using the term caused here. By caused, what I mean is that every action of the will is causally related to the factors that influence our decision-making, meaning, simply, that while they are indeed our choices, every one of those choices has a specific reason that motivated it. The choice is causally related to its influencing factors because it cannot be separated from that reason. Rather than being made in a vacuum, the choice is a necessary response or reflection of the impact that one or more internal or external factors, such as desire, emotion, environment, logical inference, etc., has on the will. Now, the superficiality of the non-Calvinist position is quickly revealed when the average non-Calvinist is asked to define what he or she means by free will. Most often, neither of the above options will be provided as a definition, at least initially. Usually, the only definition that will be offered is something along the lines of, quote, free will means that we have the ability to choose, end quote. But as I've already noted, this is not an answer to the question at all, because every view of the will, including those views which argue against free will, acknowledge that we have the ability to choose. The question does not concern whether that ability is present. The question concerns the nature of the ability. So, even when non-Calvinists believe they have defined free will, most often they have not. They assume a definition in their arguments, but they have not critically analyzed their thought deeply enough to articulate specifically what it is they are actually assuming. This is problematic as it hinders the non-Calvinist from being able to test and examine the validity of what he believes to be true, which should naturally raise suspicions concerning the role that unchecked tradition plays in determining one's beliefs. But we must examine these things. We can describe the will as either uncaused or caused. When asked in this way, that is the will uncaused or caused, the non-Calvinist will almost invariably answer the former, the will is uncaused. But I suggest no one actually believes this to be the case. The language is attractive, which is why people will say they believe it to be true. However, upon careful examination, the idea quickly becomes unfeasible. As mentioned earlier, there are two ways in which we can describe a will that is uncaused. We can either say that our choices are unaffected by internal and external factors, or that internal and external factors such as desire, emotion, logical inference, etc., have the potential to influence our decisions, but are not guaranteed to determine the outcomes. On these views, choices may or may not be impacted by underlying motives, but ultimately in either case it is not necessary that those motives always and inevitably determine the outcome. But the problem with this view is that it implies that decision-making, at least in theory, can occur in a vacuum. That is, even given all these potential influences, one can still make a choice that ultimately was not directly impacted or motivated by anything outside itself. It simply happened, and there was no reason that caused it to happen. If this is the theory free will is told to, they face insurmountable problems. For one, there is no way to distinguish the act of willing on this view from an act of random chance. This destroys all grounds for reliability in an individual's choices. The reason we believe we can trust people, the reason we feel we can know what kind of decision a person is likely to make, is because we assume that an individual's character traits are necessarily going to impact their decision-making. This assumes that choices are causally made. If it were possible for an individual to truly make choices that are uncaused, there would necessarily be no way to even begin to predict a person's choices. A person would have absolutely no grounds for rationally believing that the next time he encounters his best friend, for example, he will not arbitrarily pull out a knife and stab him to death. The very fact that we trust people and believe we can predict the choices, or at least the range of choices, of others, indicates that on a subconscious level we recognize and presuppose that all our decisions are necessarily impacted by underlying factors. This is simply another way of saying that our choices are causally related to the factors that influence them. Further, choices can have no meaning if they are uncaused. One of the fascinating ironies of criticisms that are leveled against Calvinism is that they can often be turned right around on the non-Calvinist on an even more legitimate basis. One such example is when non-Calvinists suggest that a man's decision to love Christ is not a real and meaningful decision unless it is made, quote-unquote, freely. But the irony here is that meaning is based in causation, not freedom. The very language of meaning presupposes purpose, and the very language of purpose presupposes determination. If an individual made a completely arbitrary choice to choose Christ, then it was meaningless. It had no motive. It was just a random, thoughtless act. Of course, every non-Calvinist would say that those who choose Christ certainly have motive for doing so. They want to choose him, for instance. But as soon as one confesses that this is so, they admit that choices are caused, not uncaused. A choice that is based on a particular motive or reason is a choice that is born out of a causal influence. There were underlying factors that caused the individual to choose the way he did. And again, bear in mind here that the way in which I'm using the term caused is simply the way one might use the term influence. When I say that an individual's choices are caused by their underlying factors, I mean that those underlying motives influence the choice. But my point in using the terminology of causation is that the term influence can imply the idea that this underlying motive might impact your decision, but it's not necessarily going to determine the outcome. My argument is that's not possible. You always reason according to underlying motives. Those motives necessarily determine whether you're going to choose one way over another. And so that's why I'm using the term caused, and that's all I really mean by it. Now there is another ironic implication of the idea that our choices are uncaused. Again, the non-Calvinists will often assert that in order for an individual to legitimately be held responsible for his choices, those choices must be quote-unquote free. But just as meaning is grounded in causation, so is responsibility. If an individual's choosing is not necessarily causally related to any character trait or other underlying influence, we cannot legitimately call it his choice. A random, purposeless, uncaused act with no meaning or motive necessarily underlying it cannot even be called a choice of the individual. If a man murders his friend, and one were to suggest that his choices were uncaused, we would lose all grounds for accusing the culprit of being responsible for the murder. Yet if we admit that it was his choice, then we further evidence our conviction that the choice was determined by underlying motives, or character traits, and/or other factors. It is, in fact, the recognition of underlying motive that causes us to say a criminal is guilty for his actions. Now, one might object to these complaints by suggesting that in saying that choices are uncaused, we do not have to go to such an extreme as concluding that they are random acts which are never influenced by other factors. It is possible to say, in other words, that underlying motives can more or less have an impact on our decisions, but won't necessarily determine or cause the choices that will be made. However, again, this objection misses the point. In fact, it concedes the point, because remember the way in which I'm using the term cause. It is the very nature of the human will to act according to its motives. Either a decision has a motive behind it or it does not. If it does not, it is a random, arbitrary act. If it does, then the decision is causally related to the motive, for the decision was made precisely because the individual acted on that motive and not another. And one might say, but I have various options to choose from, and I can reason between which option I want to choose and decide. I have motives to choose both. There are reasons that would influence me to choose one or the other, but I still choose between one or the other. There is not a motive that causes me to choose one action over the other. But again, this objection misses the point, because the very act of considering various possibilities, weighing the pros and cons, and deciding upon which desire to act is itself an act of choosing according to a logical inference or reasoning process that is made. So that itself is a motive that is causally related to its resulting action or choice. The very logical inference, the very reasoning between different options, that is a motive that is causally related to the choice that you end up making. And so there is simply no way of describing the human will as uncaused without simultaneously denying that an individual's choices are his choices. And so again, the real irony here is that while the non-Calvinist criticizes Calvinism in saying that choices have to be quote-unquote free in order to be, the individual's own choices and for the individual to be responsible for those choices, the real irony is that Responsibility and meaning presuppose causation. An individual's choices are not legitimately his choices unless there is a causally related motive that determines the outcome. Your choices cannot be uncaused, and those choices still legitimately be choices, your choices. There's just no way of that working. So this should help us to begin to articulate some meaningful definitions. The will is uncaused is not a feasible definition. If we say the ability to choose anything whatsoever, that clearly would not work in defining the nature or extent of the will, so any view that would postulate or presuppose such a definition for free will is not thinkable. Any acceptable definition of the will must include a condition that defines a limit on what the will is capable of doing, namely, a limit that describes the fact that choices are causally related to their motivating factors. We could say, for example, that man is capable of choosing anything he desires. This definition asserts that a man's choices are his own, but it also applies a causal condition, his desire, which determines what the outcome of his decisions can be. However, as I mentioned earlier, this would not be a legitimate definition for free will because there is no distinguishing between this concept and what it means to simply have a will. If we define will and free will in the same way, and many do this all the time, we are guilty of equivocating the meaning of these terms, for we ignore the fact that the addition of the adjective should tell us something about the nature of the will that is not inherently implied in the definition of will. Thus, we can objectively conclude that free will is simply a fiction. We cannot define it as an ability to uncausedly choose between any range of actions because of the problems already mentioned, but we also cannot define it as the ability to causally choose between actions, because that seems to equate the act of choosing freely with the mere act of choosing at all, which communicates nothing new. Why call it a free choice if all one really means is that it's a choice? As it turns out, calling the will free is often nothing more than an attempt for many to deny the idea that God quote-unquote forces men to choose one way or the other. But all this demonstrates is that the critic fails to recognize a distinction where there is one. The common non-Calvinist sees only two options. Either God forces people to do things against their will, or we have free will. It is not often that they will recognize that you're not limited to those two options. They won't recognize it because they assume a very nebulous concept of free will without ever articulating what they really mean by it. When you ask them, what is free will, they'll say something to the effect of, man has the ability to choose. But when you probe their arguments and question their presuppositions, what you'll find is that they're actually assuming a much more specific definition than that. They just don't articulate it because they haven't really thought through it themselves. But their arguments presuppose a much more specific definition of the will than just the ability to choose, and we'll see that in a minute. Both Calvinists and non acknowledge that men have a will, an ability to make their own choices. The real question is, and always has been, are those choices causally related to their motives? And we've already established this to be the case. And if so, what is the ground of those motives? Where do the motives come from? Who or what is responsible for them? When we start to ask these questions, we can begin to see and understand that denying free will does not require denying the idea that men have a will. Calvinists believe that men do indeed have a will. Their position is simply that the will is enslaved to its desires, always choosing according to what the heart is inclined toward. Hence, the will exists, but it is not free. Good trees bear good fruit, bad trees bear bad fruit. You can't have a good tree that chooses between good and bad, or a bad tree that can choose between good and bad. Born into sin, natural man will always choose sin, because that is his desire. Give him all the opportunities for Christ you want, he will not take them. It is only when the Spirit sovereignly chooses to regenerate the sinner's heart that he is then granted the desire for righteousness, upon which he will irresistibly act in choosing Christ, not because God makes him, but because that is his new desire. Now, while there are various non-Calvinist positions, and I really should say synergists, because I don't mean to refer to all Lutherans, for example, in my non-Calvinist label here. But while there are various synergist positions, one thing that all share in common is the idea that man is capable of equally choosing between sin and righteousness. And this is ultimately how they end up defining free will. But the careful reader will already be able to note the problem that I perceive here. If man is capable of choosing equally between sin and righteousness, that entails that one of two possibilities must be true. One, the choice between the two is uncaused, because although desires for sin or righteousness may potentially have influence, neither directly causes the resulting choice. Hence, free will is defined as the ability to make an uncaused choice. Or two, the choice between the two is caused, because there is some kind of logical inference or other factor at play that necessarily motivates the individual to choose one and not the other. Hence, free will, quote-unquote, is defined as the ability to make one's own choices according to his own unique desires or influences, as opposed to one given by God. So now we've hammered out the real position that most non-Calvinists take. When they describe free will, they'll try to describe it in a non-causal way, that is, similar to option number one. But if you really push them to articulate their position, they'll end up explaining position number two. What they really mean by free will is something like this second option, even though, as I've suggested, we cannot legitimately call it free will, and we should do away with that terminology. If we say that man naturally possesses the desire for sin as a result of the fall, but is not necessarily entailed by that desire to only and always choose sin, or if we say that God gives man the desire for righteousness by his act of grace, but man is not necessarily entailed by that desire to choose Christ and forsake sin, we can explain this either by saying that the reason neither desire entails a certain outcome is because nothing necessarily causes the choice, which is option number one, or by saying that the reason neither desire entails a certain outcome is because the choice was caused by man comparing and contrasting the two options, weighing the pros and cons, and reasoning for himself what the outcome should be, which is option number two. Now, we've already discredited the first option. If the choice between the two is uncaused, then it cannot legitimately be called a choice of the individual, nor can it be said that the individual chose Christ meaningfully. In this case of the second option, we have an equally serious dilemma. If we can acknowledge that the choice was caused by its motive, then we need to further ask what the basis of that motive is. Perhaps you see where I'm going with this. The position has already assumed that God has given an equal measure of grace to every man. He has treated every man equally, but this means that God's grace alone cannot be the basis of the motive which determines an individual to embrace Christ. If it were, we should see everyone making the same choice, because supposedly God has treated everyone the same. And so if God has treated everybody the same, then if that grace alone is what causes salvation, then everyone should be making the same choice. Yet we continue to see many reject Christ while others embrace him. There is an obvious difference. So this can only mean that the cause of the difference, that is the reason that some accept Christ and others reject him, the basis of the motive leading to these decisions is something inherent in the unique character of each individual making the choice. This is the only thing that can explain, if we assume God has treated everyone equally, why we see different people making different choices. Some people's choices are caused by motives which are based on personal virtue, while other people's choices are caused by motives which are based on personal vice. Even though God supposedly gave the same measure of grace to every single individual, whether or not the individual will actually embrace Christ depends on whether they are smart enough, or kind enough, or humble enough, or whatever the case may be, to develop the motive to make good out of the grace that God has given. Whereas the reason that others do not embrace Christ is because they fail to achieve the same. Either they are less intelligent, more prideful, or whatever, but ultimately the reason they reject Christ is because when they weighed the pros and cons between the choices offered them, their character produced a negative motive. However you describe this, you cannot say that God's grace is what causes an individual to come to faith if you also say that God has given the same measure of grace to every man. Because if that grace alone is what causes man to come to faith, then you should see everyone coming to faith if that measure of grace has been given to everyone. So you've basically got two options. The fact that some people come to Christ and some do not has to mean one of two things. If you say that we are saved by grace alone, and you believe that consistently, then you must acknowledge that God's grace has only been extended to some, and that's the cause of the difference. But if you say that God's grace has been extended to everyone, then you can't consistently say that grace alone saves. what you're actually saying is that God's grace makes salvation available to people, but it's not enough. Man has to add something to it to make it effective. And so the implication in denying Reformed theology is simply that Christians are better people than non-Christians because they have made the right decision where others have failed. They have chosen to do what is right, while others have chosen to be criminals. Now, this conclusion will surely offend, but is it wrong? To be sure, the Arminian would never articulate such a position. I certainly realize that. They agree with the Calvinists that we are saved by grace alone through faith alone. But my point is, non-Calvinists are inconsistent in that they say one thing, but presuppose, whether consciously or not, something else in their arguments. And that has been my point all along, and that is precisely what has been demonstrated here. There is no possible way of defining and arguing free will without, 1, postulating a nonsensical idea, that is, an uncaused will, 2, equivocating on terminology, resulting in either agreeing with the Calvinist view of the will, or attacking a misrepresentation of Calvinism rather than the real thing, or 3, implying a form of works righteousness and salvation, thus giving man reason to boast in his decision. So, free will, it's a myth. It is a fiction of human philosophy that has infected the church, and it has continued to spread by tradition and by the failure to carefully examine our terminology and our beliefs according to Scripture. We must turn to Scripture, not philosophy, to define our doctrines of man and salvation. And so that is what I would do in upcoming and future posts, where I will be presenting a more positive case for the bondage of the will from Scripture, and explain exactly what that means and how it makes sense to say that the will is in bondage, and yet we still make choices that we are legitimately held responsible for. As a last word, I'll explain just briefly the Calvinist position on the will. If you don't like the label Calvinist, call it something else. But ultimately, this is the only option one has to avoid the problems we have considered in this post. Calvinists believe that man has a will. They believe that man is capable of making his own choices. But what we mean by that is that we choose according to what we desire to choose. We escape the problems that are implied by the definition of an uncaused will because we believe all choices are causally related to underlying motives and other factors. Further, we argue that the will is not free, but in bondage, meaning natural men are enslaved to sin, and those who come to embrace Christ do so because God has given them the desire to do so, upon which they will necessarily, though willfully, act, because it is their desire. In other words, the natural-born man will never choose Christ, not because God prevents him from doing so, but because his own sin nature keeps him from ever having the desire or ability to consider such an option, let alone act on it. Natural man loves his sin, and so he will always choose to remain in rebellion to Christ, unless and until God sovereignly changes that desire. And this is what happens in the regeneration, the new birth. This is why it is necessary for a man to be born again, and it is why it only makes sense to say that regeneration precedes the choice to come to Christ. God's sovereign choice to save the sinner from his bondage and sin is what gives rise to the sinner's desire to choose Christ in the first place. When God grants the desire for Christ, the new heart will certainly act on it favorably because that is its ultimate desire. Thus, Calvinism also escapes the problem of providing Christians with the grounds for boasting. Calvinism does not affirm that God's work of grace in men merely enables them to equally choose between sin and righteousness. It affirms instead that God's work of grace in men necessarily compels them to respond in favor to Christ. And again, by compel, I'm meaning that in the sense that I've defined causation here. I mean an influence. Not God dragging you kicking and screaming, but an influence, the giving of a desire. But you see, when he gives you that desire, you will necessarily act on it because it's what you want. It's not that he forces you to do it, but in giving you that desire, it's what you want to choose, and so you will necessarily choose it. And so, while it is a necessary act on the part of the individual, it is still legitimately the individual's act, because he is merely choosing according to the desire of his heart. And we see over and over and over again that this is the way that the will is described and implied in Scripture, as we'll see in my upcoming videos and posts. The man is simply doing what he wants to do. Thus, the Calvinist view suggests that man's choice to embrace Christ is no more caused by God's grace than all of man's choices are caused by other motives and influences. All choices are causally related to their influences. All choices have reasons and motives behind them. The only difference is that in the case of the individual choosing Christ, the sovereign grace given to the individual is that motivating factor. God changes the heart so that it possesses a new desire, and the individual chooses to act on it because he wants to. So if all choices are necessarily related, causally related to their underlying factors, then when we say that God determines that an individual will choose a particular way, that does not mean that God drags him kicking and screaming against his will to do something. It means that God instills the desire within the individual's heart upon which he will necessarily but willfully choose to act. And so in one act, in one process, you have God determining a willing choice. You have God determining a willing choice, determining that the man will willfully choose to do something according to what he wants to do. We see this, both sides of the truth, so to speak, presented in Scripture. Finally, this explains why some people choose Christ and others do not, without giving Christians any grounds for boasting. The reason is simply that God does not extend this grace to every man. His choice is based in his own sovereign good pleasure and not in anything in us. Now, again, surely there are many questions and objections the non-Calvinists would raise at this point. Trust me, I've heard them all. I was once a non-Calvinist myself. So I'm fully aware of all the objections that would be raised here, and I'm tempted to anticipate and respond to all of them, but that's going to have to wait for future posts. So for now, I thank you for listening. I would invite you to rate and subscribe, and again, if you want to interact with this article, please visit my blog. I posted the link to this article in the description. You can go to my blog there. I have a comment section, and I'd be happy to interact with you there, but I'm not going to debate this subject here because it's just too impractical to try to do it in 500 comments or less. So thank you again for listening.